Good morning and welcome to the second episode of Porch Economics. I'm your host, Professor Todd Yarbrough. I'm an economics professor at Purdue University here in hot West Lafayette, Indiana. You'll no doubt notice if you're watching this from YouTube that we're not on the back porch. That's because despite it only being about 10 a.m., it is already 90 degrees. I think I will be able to produce a better episode if I wasn't sweating. So let's go there. One of the things I believe I mentioned in the first episode is that there is a lot of consensus in economics about some relatively basic things. Obviously, as the subject matter gets a little bit more complex, you're always going to have natural divergences of opinions, but along certain ideas and concepts, there tends to be pretty strong consensus, and tariffs are absolutely one of them. And tariffs are one of them also because they are, like several other issues and policies, bad both in terms of theory. The theory predicts they're not a good idea, and then the data, the empirical sort of record on tariffs would also suggest that they're not really a good idea, especially for a country such as. So we start off with just the basic idea that a tariff is a tax, what in particular what we call a commodity tax. This is a tax on a good or a service, as opposed to, say, a tax on income, wealth, or anything like that. So you can think about it sort of similar to a sales tax in a way. And so the idea is that if I purchase a product that has this particular tax, then the tax is going to affect some things, in the market. We're going to keep things real simple here, and we're just going to kind of use the basic tax wedge model of economics. And that says that if you tax a product, what you do is you cause there to be a wedge driven between the price that the consumer pays for the product and then what the producer, the seller, receives for the product, right? Because typically, if there's no tax, then whatever price you pay is what the seller actually receives. But when you tax a product, you now create this distance between those two relative prices. That's why we call it the tax wedge model. So consumers are paying higher prices, producers are now receiving lower prices. This, as a result, pushes us to less quantity demand and less quantity supplied, because your consumers are paying higher prices, so they want less of the good. Producers are receiving less for the product, therefore they're going to want to produce less of the good. And so the tax has the effect of reducing both how much people want of the product as well as how much people want to produce of the product. And then the other thing that the tax does is it sort of generates revenue. Now, really simply, there is effectively only two reasons ever why you tax. You tax to deter, so you tax things that you want less of, or you tax to generate revenue. Now, there are situations where you can do both, and that's sort of sometimes the political goal, although typically from an economist perspective, you're only doing one or the other, right? So if you use a tax to deter behavior, such as like a cigarette tax or an alcohol tax, the point of that tax is to deter. It is to distort. You want people to consume less. You want producers to produce less because you're actively trying to reduce the amount of activity in that particular market. And so in that sense, the goal is not to generate revenue. It's if you want more deterrence, raise the tax. If you want less deterrence, you can decrease the tax. So that's the beauty of tax as a policy mechanism, is that we tend to think we know how it works. And so therefore we know what it will do if you change it. If you increase taxes, if you decrease taxes, you know kind of what's going to happen. That's, in a way, that's why economists like taxation, not necessarily maybe philosophically, but just from a policy perspective, because it's easy. It's easy to explain, it's easy to understand, and we sort of know what's going to happen most of the time. It doesn't always mean there aren't counterintuitive outcomes, right? In many ways, that's kind of what economists end up being almost uniquely interested in. Now, on the revenue side, if the goal of the tax is to generate revenue, then you get a kind of a different sort of philosophy or strategy in terms of that tax. Instead of deterring or distorting, in fact, you want that tax not really to distort anything. You would prefer instead to tax things in which the behavioral change is going to be minimal. And of course, the point of that is that you want to generate consistent revenue. You want to know how much revenue you're going to actually generate from that tax. And so therefore, you tax things that are going to produce the sort of consistent revenue stream. Now, in terms of tariffs, um, you know, there's sort of, you can do both with tariffs, not at the same time, mind you, but a tariff is a tax. So you can use tariffs to deter economic behavior, or you can try to use tariffs to generate revenue. So now, let's sort of switch gears for a moment. So we kind of know what a tariff is, right? It's a tariff is a tax on imported good or service, right? So again, we can think about it in terms of particular industries, or we can think about it in terms of every good that is being imported either from anybody. Maybe we have tariffs on every country, or just particular countries. Again, it's not necessarily that important that we think about them any one particular way, because they can be a lot of different things. Just the idea here that you should keep in mind is that you are increasing the price to consumers of the imported good. In a sense, you're decreasing the incentive, the economic incentive, because you're reducing the value in a sense to the consumer, because they're paying higher price but getting the same product. So the disincentive to consume, you're also disincentivizing production. So actually, when we think about what's being tariffed, the producer in the foreign country, which might actually be an American company, which we'll talk about in a moment as well, they are also, of course, in a sense, damaged by the tariff, because they get a lower price for it, and they want to produce, in a sense, less. So those are the two sort of parties who are directly affected by a tariff, right? You have the domestic consumer or producer who's importing products into the U.S., right? The consumer consumes, the producer uses them perhaps in the construction of a final product, right? U.S. companies, bring in a lot of, rare earth minerals and things of that nature for the final production of like high tech products. So when we talk about, and that becomes a very important part of this as well. So when we talk about importation, we're not just thinking about this from the consumption perspective. We're also thinking about it from U.S. producers to also take advantage of foreign markets and import what we refer to as intermediate goods. Those are the goods that are used in the production of final products. And so that ends up also being a really important part of the story. Now, the other major part of the story, which is canonical in economics, in terms of what we would refer to as sort of basic economic ideas, and that is the sort of trade flows, and what constitutes trade flows, what creates those trade flows, and then ultimately why is it that economists like trade so much. So if the idea here is that we're going to discuss why economists dislike tariffs so much, in many ways the answer to that is, why do economists like trade so much? So let's start with the sort of question of, why does trade occur? Well, trade occurs for fairly obvious reasons, right? That this person over here has something that I want or need, but I don't have. I happen to have something they also want or need, and don't have. And so then there's this opportunity for us to exchange, and then there's mutual benefits, right? I benefit from the exchange, they benefit from the exchange. And the idea is that if you think about this in terms of like a bunch of people making a bunch of exchanges, there's a clear benefit, not just to, the group, but benefits on both sides, right? This is like the basis of market economics, mutual benefits. People engage in transactions because there's mutual benefits, and that's everything from like luxury items, like people buy luxury sports cars, and that benefits them because they get the luxury sports car and they get to feel like they're cool, I guess. And then the company that makes the luxury sports car, of course, benefits from that transaction, all the way down to like necessities, right? So you need electricity in your house, you pay your electric bill, you get the benefit of the electricity, and then there is someone within the context of energy supply who's making money off of the distribution, the creation, the extraction of the energy required for the electricity. So again, mutual benefits. So we can think about this in terms of needs and wants, just anything that's purchased on a market. Now, we can think about this in an international sense, which is, again, that there are people in foreign markets who have things that we don't have access to necessarily, and we would like them, and vice versa, right? Classic example is Brazilian coffee, or any kind of coffee, right? Coffee is only grown in a relatively small number of places on Earth that have particular soil compositions, have particular air, wind speed transitions, and enough rain, and so on and so forth. And so it creates this sort of geographic specialization, and that geographic specialization pushes what we refer to as a comparative advantage. So in economics, comparative advantage is the idea that the companies in my country seem to specialize in particular things. Now, why those comparative advantages exist aren't just for things like geographic reasons, like Brazilian coffee, but you also get comparative advantages because of over time there might be some particular learned innovation within a particular industry, right? So, for example, in the U.S., we have a comparative advantage in the creation of high-tech products. There's nothing geographic about that. We don't produce high-tech products because of geographic regions, because we have Rocky Mountains and Smoky Mountains and the Mississippi River, right? No, we produce high-tech products because our economy has evolved to have a comparative advantage in high-tech industries, mostly because of our higher education system and the extent of highly educated people in the U.S. who then transition to the technology industry, and that really drives innovation in the technology industry. And so that becomes our comparative advantage. And so you have all these sort of reasons why countries either have or develop over time comparative advantages. Now, the way that you should think about comparative advantages is that they are efficiencies. So the reason ultimately that private companies in a particular country over time tend to produce goods or become good at producing goods and services of a particular type, this also means that they become efficient and are more efficient than firms in other countries. And sort of in the sense of how we know that's true is that if they weren't more efficient, then the other companies would survive and they wouldn't, right? Because in market economies, when there's a lot of competition, what ends up keeping companies around is their ability to innovate. And typically when we think about innovation, that's bringing costs down. And so when we think about, the extent to which a lot of like low cost manufacturing moved overseas from the United States, we often put that, almost squarely on low wages. And that might be sort of in part what kind of kicked off that process. But really what has maintained the inertia of that particular process is that also over time in those countries, there has been this sort of learn by doing process where they are just now way better, way more efficient at low cost manufacturing than we are in the US. And we're way better at high cost manufacturing, high tech manufacturing in the US. We're more efficient at it. And what we mean by more efficient here is that if other countries tried high-tech manufacturing, it would cost them a lot more money relative to the benefit they would get out of it than it does for our companies to do that. In the same token, if we instead tried to do low-cost manufacturing, we would do so at a much higher cost relative to value than could be done in other countries. So that would be inefficient. So if everyone tries to, instead of allowing sort of markets to kind of distribute these efficiencies in a fairly natural way, then instead what ends up happening is you have countries and often politicians in those countries choosing the industries that are in their given country, and economists don't have a lot of faith that would naturally be efficient in the same way that we believe if instead it's driven by these relative comparative advantages, that there's sort of a natural efficiency to that. Now, that's why trade occurs. We think there's all these comparative advantages that are driven, by private companies in countries, either having, direct advantages or developing those advantages over time. And there's a lot of reasons why those can occur. And then basically what this does is it creates a trade outcome, a trade flow scenario, if you will, where just kind of at the end of the day, this is where certain things are made, and this is where they're imported, this is where they're exported, so on and so forth. And so to an economist, if we were to say talk about something like the trade deficit, or I guess just say the trade balance, that's just sort of the outcome of trade flows, sort of necessarily. It might be something that we're interested in. We might be curious, what is the trade balance? But at the end of the day, it is an outcome. It isn't necessarily sort of a choice. Now we could try to choose to change the trade balance, So very often, American politicians argue that we should try to reverse the fact that the U.S. has a trade deficit. We'll get into in just a moment why the U.S. has a trade deficit and why it's probably not a good idea for us to reverse it just because of the existence of the trade deficit. But it's just sort of the outcome. It's like you take, we had this much imports this year, we have this much exports this year, and basically since the late 80s, the U.S. has run a trade deficit. Um, you might have noticed the U.S. economy's done pretty well since then, but I'll point that out. And then, in terms of, there's also this really important piece that I mentioned previously is that increasingly the way that we also think about trade is also in the context of supply chains. So it isn't just, I'm importing like nice European cheese or like good Brazilian or good Haitian coffee, and benefiting the companies in those countries as a result as well. But it's also about, U.S. companies, importing products so that they can then use them for the production of their own products. And so that sort of also means that you have to think about the extent of the trade flows, especially in the U.S. in terms of those supply chains. And so you have to think about costs. So if there are these efficiencies that are developed in other countries where those countries and really the firms in those countries can make things at a much cheaper cost than we can in the U.S., and especially if there's no sort of real quality problems there. People have often talked about the quality problems of imported products, and I think that's certainly kind of worthy of our discussion. But regardless, and so if a U.S. company can import it cheaper than they can make it themselves, then that means it's an efficiency for them. And if it's an efficiency for them, that means they're going to have more net income as a result if they do that, right? It's profit maximizing for them to do this. And so in a way, the way that we are now, the way the trade flows are now is heavily pushed by the fact that U.S. supply chains are heavily dependent upon all these comparative advantages that exist in other countries. All right, so that's why trade occurs, right? There's these comparative advantages. Now, over time, of course, economies are dynamic. You sort of go through time, things change, right? Sort of comparative advantages can change. They arise, they go away. There is this sort of cyclical sort of idea in market-based, capitalist-based economic systems where, old, weak markets are going to die, and then stronger markets are going to rise. Okay, this is a very important concept in economics called creative destruction. And creative destruction is very real, and we sort of have a lot of examples of it, right? The classic example is there used to be a thriving typewriter industry in the U.S., both from the consumption as well as the production side, and then over time that died for the most part, but then that in a sense gave rise to the computer industry, and the computer industry replaced it. And the beautiful thing there is that the computer industry kind of on net is a much more valuable industry than the typewriter industry because you can do a lot more with computers than you could with typewriters. So it was in a sense short run problematic that we lost economic output and jobs in the typewriter industry, and but it was all over the long run certainly a much better thing that we evolved away from typewriters into computers. Now, the problem with creative destruction is that there are real human costs to it. So there were people who were trained to work in the typewriter industry. They were very good at it. They had comparative advantages in working in the typewriter industry, and they didn't necessarily know how to work in the computer industry. They couldn't make that transition, or maybe there weren't any other sort of industries that they were sort of necessarily good at. That is a big problem. So that brings up an important sort of macroeconomic issue, and that's called structural unemployment. So structural unemployment is unemployment that arises from basically a skill mismatch. You have these people who want jobs, they have skills. You have potential employers who have jobs that have other skills that are needed. And so there's this mismatch. And so we call it structural unemployment. There's nothing you can really do in the short run for structural unemployment. The only thing you can really do over the long run is basically take those people and try to move them back into the labor force. So typically with like educational services, job training programs. The other thing you can try to do is you can try to bring industry, new industry to those people. But that's also problematic because again, that there might be a sort of a skill mismatch, right? This has been somewhat of a conversation that we've had in terms of like the coal industry dying in the U.S. Sort of South. And then often there's sort of two sides. We either try to keep the coal jobs or maybe even try to bring them back. And then the other argument is no, let's encourage, for example, like photovoltaic production. So replacing coal, industry with solar panel industry or some other sort of particular industry. That would certainly be a potential way to do it. We'll talk in a moment about why that sort of what we call industrial policy is a bit problematic. The truth of the matter is that the nature of markets and the nature of creative destruction is that they absolutely create these regional divergences in economic prosperity. So you have places that lose in a sense because of capitalism. They lose in a sense because of market economies. The U.S. economy may be completely fine, but you might have this region that say used to be a boom area and now is a complete bust area, right? I live in Indiana. A great example of this is Gary, Indiana. Gary, Indiana used to be like one of the more bustling places in America, and now you go there and it's a very sort of depressed economic place. There's still people that live there, and it's really nice areas as well. But just as a city, there's a lot of economic dysfunction there, and it's been economically, in a sense, in that dysfunction for a long time. Gary is a great example of a town that when the industrial sort of part moved out, there wasn't any kind of backfilling of jobs, and so what you had is chronic structural unemployment, and then because labor ends up being less mobile than capital, people aren't necessarily able to just move, to where the jobs are. And so areas sometimes get sort of locked in. So these regional divergences can certainly persist for a very long time. It is, in a way, kind of, again, a natural byproduct of a market based economic system. There's not really a whole lot you can do about it. It's not possible necessarily to keep every regional economic system in terms of complete health. Also because in a way, in the way we think about creative destruction, is that you need some economic dysfunction in order for the economy to sort of purge sort of the dead parts, right? I think the good analogy here is, you need a forest fire every once in a while, right? A natural forest fire. If you don't have a natural forest fire, then you don't sort of burn off all the dead stuff, and then it might actually reduce the sort of overall biological diversity of a natural forest. So every once in a while, you need a natural forest fire, and the thing is that that's going to cause a lot of damage, and market economic systems, as they evolve, they cause economic misery. People lose jobs, and it's not something that I think that we should just sort of ignore. And I think, again, this is a place where economists really run into trouble, because we're over here cheerleading international trade and saying globalization is great and all this, and tariffs are bad and all this. And then people just point to a town like Gary, Indiana, or Youngstown, Ohio, or any other place in America, where people have pointed to and shown economic dysfunction, and then argued that this was some sort of policy failure. And very often, the policy failure in question is the federal government allowed these jobs to move overseas. And of course, what this ends up doing, the net effect of this is it really causes people to lose sight of those mutual benefits, right? When we go back and we talk about the gains from trade, economists believe so strongly in trade because, in a sense, the models tell us there should be gains from trade, there should be mutual benefits. And again, the empirical data tells us that trade is very good for countries, right? If you look at like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that was put together and signed in the 90s, Canada, US, and Mexico have definitely benefited all from that particular agreement. Now, we could certainly argue that some countries, America, have benefited more than the other two countries. We could make that argument, and I think you probably have an argument there, but they've all benefited. Now, have all pockets of all regions in all three countries benefited the same way? No, and that's kind of impossible. This is where I think economists you start to sort of be accused of being unfeeling. Because if I'm telling you that, well, actually, it's a good thing that Gary, Indiana, is this economic dysfunctioned place, then it makes me seem heartless. And that's not the argument. The argument is not that Gary, Indiana, in particular, it's good that that place is economically dysfunctioned. What it's saying is that an actual healthy part of your economic system is going to create those potentially regional divergences in economic outcomes. And as a result, you are going to have potentially these pockets of regional dysfunction, even if your overall economic system is doing just fine. So a quick, very quick little story to sort of illustrate this point. Much is often made about the loss of automotive manufacturing jobs, specifically from states such as Michigan or Ohio. And then again, it's not just bad for Michigan. It's often that story is told as this is bad for the United States. We lost these manufacturing jobs. What's interesting about that is that actually the first migration of automotive manufacturing jobs was not overseas. That probably makes a lot of sense to people when you say this. It was just to the American South. And it went to the American South for a couple different reasons. The big reason was there was no unions in the South. And the unions in the northern states, such as Michigan, had really driven up the cost of automobile production, for better or for worse, right? I tend to be fairly pro-union, although I think they have their own problems, often from a management sort of power perspective. But that was, so they had driven wages way up in the north, and as a result, it was just cheaper to move to the south and pay people comparatively less wages. And also, it was sort of new economic territory, and so automotive companies were able to really subvert the unions, and there was a lot more union busting that was sort of allowed in southern states as well. But on net, in terms of the entire U.S. economy, the U.S. automotive manufacturers still did well. There were now new jobs for folks in the American South. The American South had been really struggling economically. Oddly enough, by actually shifting some of the economic behavior from the north, which had been doing well for a long time, to the south, an area that had not been doing well economically for a long time, for a lot of different reasons, it was in a sense net positive for the country, because it's like an efficiency gain. They're sort of diminishing returns to economic benefits. So if you have an area that's been sort of doing really well economically, and it loses a little bit, you're not losing as much. And then if there's an area that has not been doing well economically and it gains a lot, then you sort of feel the totality of those benefits in a way. So from a kind of a raw economic perspective, that shifting of jobs from the north to the south was kind of inherently good, and it was good for the U.S. automotive companies. It was certainly bad for the people in Michigan. It was bad for the folks in Flint, Michigan. It was bad for the folks in Detroit. So it created a lot of this regional economic dysfunction. Now, to an economist, one argument we would make is that regions should work a little bit more to ensure that they have industrial diversity. So we would argue that one of the problems with Michigan was that it had put too many, all of its eggs into one basket. The automotive industry had really become kind of the dominant force. It allowed it to become politically sort of forceful in the state. Therefore, sort of policies were being driven ultimately by the automotive industry. And I think ultimately that feeds into the size of the economic fallout that occurs when those automotive manufacturing jobs start to move over. So I think there's some complexity there to where the actual policy failure is, and ultimately there is really no policy failure to the extent that there was an offshoring, or I should say a migration of jobs to the U.S. South, and then of course eventually those jobs turn into offshoring as well. That's not really so much a policy failure, right? That's capitalism. That's markets seeking efficiencies. Now, if you believe that it's up to the government to keep jobs in the country, for particularly industrial important reasons, then yeah, maybe you see that as sort of a policy failure. We should have stopped those jobs from moving overseas. But to an economist, that's sort of like walking upriver, as opposed to just sort of swimming with the current. So you're trying to push against the kind of natural efficiency seeking aspects, and you're trying to sort of enforce your own industrial preference on a market. Again, economists have very little faith that that's going to be efficient, and so economists take a very long run view of this. And basically, the idea is that we sort of compare two worlds: the world where there's no trade, or at least like very little trade, and then the world where there is either completely free trade or at least there's a lot of trade. Maybe there's some trade restrictions, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And so in the world where there's no trade, economists say, well, there's no gains from trade, right? No gains for trade whatsoever. And so you have to make everything that you want. And so things are going to be very costly and it's inefficient. And, you could probably get by that way, but your standard of living is going to be quite low ultimately. The world where we trade, we get to take advantage of all the efficiencies. We get all the gains from trade, and the long run quality of life should be higher with trade than without. That's what the models say. When you turn to the data, that's exactly also what the data say. There's virtually no evidence that trade is bad. Certainly not for the U.S. The U.S. economy has roared since its markets have been opened up to the rest of the world. And when you look at most of the so-called economic miracles of the last 30 to 40 years, they have been countries that were fairly closed off to international markets and then opened themselves up and saw their economic prospects explode. There's a reason why we call them economic miracles. And so trade, it's again, economists feel so strongly about trade because to us, not only do the models give us sort of this philosophical underpinning that trade should be good, then we get sort of the confirmation that trade is actually good. And so as a result, this causes economists to have fairly strong opinions on trade. And so therefore, when the topic of tariffs comes up, we're very quick to say, oh, this is a bad idea. And so if you sort of have kind of had this conversation politicized for you, and you hear economists say tariffs are not good, as opposed to seeing that there's a reason why we feel that way, you're going to think that we're being political, and that makes kind of complete sense. So the last thing I want to talk about and put a button on this particular episode. I've already gone far longer than I wanted to, but I think there's been a lot of good stuff here. Is to talk a little bit about just protectionism in general. And by protectionism, what I mean is the imposition of trade barriers or trade restrictions, right? So again, we think in terms of like a completely free trade situation, zero trade barriers. Basically, just people are allowed to buy and sell goods across borders at will. But we can start thinking about there being some maybe good reason for there being some trade restrictions, and maybe they're not necessarily trade restrictions, but they're more just sort of rules of trade. And so this is actually one thing that economists feel very strongly about that is good, is that trade should have rules. It should be relatively free. You should be allowed to buy and sell goods across borders, but how you do that should have a set of rules attached to it, from everything from workplace safety to anti-exploitation laws to environmental protections, things that sort of ensure that when we are engaging in these transactions, they are in fact mutually beneficial. That's sort of the way that we think about quote unquote regulating trade or imposing rules on trade is that we want to think about them in terms of actually ensuring that we have those particular mutual benefits. This is not unlike the way that economists think about monopolization or antitrust policy. We think that it's okay to regulate markets if those markets are going to become uncompetitive. So in order to maintain competition, that there becomes this sort of objective ability for us to impose competitive forces through some sort of policy mechanism in the same way that we might do that through trade liberalization. So sometimes the rules, in fact, will enable trade, right? You might have a company in another country who might be unwilling to engage in trade unless there are assurances, unless there are rules, right? Just think about things from like insurance and covering cost of like theft or damage, and there have to be understanding and rules in the same way, by the way, that there are understanding and rules at the interstate level in the United States, right? There are interstate commerce laws that have to be abided by companies, even if they want to go across the border within the United States. So rules are in fact quite important. And again, very, very few economists would argue that there shouldn't be rules on how trade actually works. Now that turns us to sort of the idea of tariffs as a form of protectionism, right? Now there's two ways to think about tariffs here. One is a targeted tariff on a specific industry and perhaps even on specific industry in a specific country. So one reason why you might do this is because companies within that industry are practicing what we refer to as dumping. So dumping is a flooding of a market with especially cheap versions of a good. The point is to damage competition in other markets, right? This is similar to what OPEC does when they flood the global oil market with oil supply. They're trying to drop the price of a barrel of oil down so far that it actually damages Western and U.S. oil companies and makes it less profitable for them. In a way, they're trying to do this to sort of bend the global oil market kind of like to their will, right? And so we can think about sort of dumping as being a similar thing. Oftentimes, dumping is also predicated upon subsidization by the government. So it ends up being sort of more of a governmental thing in a way. And so tariffs have been used as a punishment mechanism for dumping numerous times. The Obama administration famously did this in response to dumping allegations of Chinese firms in terms of rubber. And so Chinese rubber was tariffed for some time until it became clear that the dumping strategy had been ended. And so they become sort of like, like speeding tickets in a way. So we have these rules of trade. We're going to trade with each other as long as those rules are maintained. But if you violate the rules, we're going to ding you with a little bit of punishment. So those sort of targeted tariffs. Economists, I think it's not that we like them. It's not that we like the idea of having to do that. I think we would sort of prefer I think we might think there are better incentive mechanisms to generate those mutual benefits. But I think that we recognize that in some sense, if you're going to have rules-based trade, you do need punishment mechanisms. Otherwise, people are just going to end up kind of seeking out their own interest and kind of ignoring the benefits of other people. So in that sense, these sort of targeted one-off tariffs, short-run tariffs, I think are not as bad as maybe the way that we see more broad tariffs. So when we start talking about tariffs now put on like every product coming from a particular country or all products coming from a particular industry, that's now when economists start to sort of be very worried, because now we go back to just kind of the basics of what a tax does to a market. And note that means that those tariffs are now going to be highly distortionary. And also, again, because of the nature of the U.S. economy and how much it benefits from trade and how much it benefits from all those comparative advantage efficiencies that we were seeing before, especially on the supply chain side, the use of broad level tariffs is going to raise the prices, not just for American consumers importing goods from other countries, but also American producers who are importing those intermediate goods. And so those broad-based tariffs, the sort of cost to them is much higher, and there's almost no benefit to them in the short run. Now, the long run game, and this has certainly been a part of what Trump has mentioned, is that this is going to reorient production back to the U.S. So by reducing the incentive to produce and consume in terms of the international market, you're going to create incentives to produce and consume in the domestic market. Economists are quite dubious about this for a couple different reasons, but mostly because the US economy is so rich, we're so wealthy, things are so expensive here that even if you were sort of to tariff everybody, most likely what would happen is that it would still be cheaper to make things in other countries than the US. And so basically what all you would do is you would just make consumers pay higher prices. You would make US producers now pay higher prices, but you're not actually going to reorient those markets back to the US because they're still going to be cheaper to do in other countries. Then the idea would be, okay, so maybe only some fraction of the industry is going to reorient itself. And again, if the reason why the industrial capacity is being reoriented is not because of comparative advantages and those efficiencies, but is instead because of tariffs. What you're doing there is you're having policymakers choose the industrial makeup, and again, we just don't believe that it's going to generate efficiencies. In a sense, you would be giving up all of those efficiencies. So our prediction is, in fact, that incomes would decline, that U.S. citizens would become less wealthy over time if you, in a sense, forced them to increasingly only consume products that are made within their borders. In a sense, this would be imposing upon U.S. citizens simply a much higher cost perspective than what they get to enjoy today. And so, the idea of sort of broad tariffs and tariffs in general is that they reduce trade flows. We think trade flows are so beneficial because theory tells us they're going to be beneficial, but also the data tells us that they have been very beneficial. But at the same time, it's important for policymakers to recognize those regional divergences, those regional pockets of dysfunction. And that's why good policies as it relates to things like unemployment insurance, job training programs, educational services, that's really where our efforts should be put into. Again, attempting to kind of reorient the global economic system to our own particular preferences, probably not going to work, so it's probably doomed to fail anyway. And then even if we are to quote unquote succeed, we're going to just be in a much more expensive, costly world than we otherwise would be. So that's pretty much the story on tariffs.